So one more for tonight. Bernie Sanders has written an article. People keep saying, or last year, in 2016, kept asking the question, what does Bernie Sanders know about foreign policy? Bernie Sanders doesn't know about foreign policy. Bernie Sanders didn't even know countries existed outside of the United States. He knows nothing about foreign policy. And here we have the most experienced person in the history of people, Hillary Clinton. Who's Bernie Sanders? Now, Bernie Sanders has, I would imagine, taken this to be somewhat of a weakness in his 2016 campaign. And he started to beef up on this, meaning he started to give speeches about foreign policy. But this article, I suspect it was republished, but I'm going to do it anyway because I like it. And I liked it. I absolutely liked it. I liked where it was going from a political standpoint, because there's aspects of the article that are just, basically raw politics, like almost brazen politics. And there's others that almost go beyond the political space, go almost as if you're overlooking the entirety of the political landscape, like you're above it all. It's an interesting article that I ended up absolutely liking, so I want to go through it. So the first point, from a standpoint of just the basic politics, the basic raw politics, and just so you can see the article that I'm talking about. Democrats need to rein in our out-of-control military spending. Written by Bernie Sanders. Democrats must challenge unnecessary spending and interventions, beginning with the war in Yemen. So for the basic politics of it, Bernie Sanders, in this, the entirety of the piece, he makes this argument that Democrats and Republicans are a singular body from the standpoint of military. And you know this for yourself. If you go back and look at the debate between Romney and Obama, when it gets to foreign policy, you have a situation where Obama would say something, Romney would I second Obama. Because the fact of the matter is, there was nothing else, there was no further right to Obama on this, with the exception of maybe a Hillary Clinton. But Democrats have taken to the military aspect pretty hawkishly, just as much, if not more so, than the Republican Party. Republicans may, be more rambunctious verbally, but ultimately the military policy almost ends up being very similar, if not the same. Sanders distances himself from both. Essentially, Democrats need to do this, and Congress needs to do this. But the entirety of the article is written from the standpoint of the Democrats need to do X, Y, Z, and to in opposition to these wars, and more critical of military spending. But the person who's writing this is technically not a Democrat. He's one independent senator for Vermont. So as Bernie kind of throws slings and arrows within this particular article at the Democratic Party, he can kind of stand outside of this and say, look, the Democratic Party needs to do X. But I just so happen am not a Democrat, and I am also just so happen the one who's writing this article, who's showing the way in what needs to take place. I like it, just from a basic political standpoint. There's an understanding that the brand is tarnished. That's to put it mildly. I mean, go out and talk to a lefty about voting for a Democrat. It's, it's somewhat grates nerves to some degree. And you can make an argument that both political parties are scathed in this way. I mean, after all, how did Donald Trump get elected if they weren't? People weren't looking for a regular Democrat or a regular Republican. In the typical way that we've known him for the last 20 years, I suspect people could start seeing through the facade. They start to look plastic. They start to look plastic. So, distancing yourself from that and being a distinction, it's just good politics. Let me tell it, it's just good politics. From the other standpoint of this, meaning Sanders, the overarching thing, the thing that where I think is a bit above it all, Sanders makes an argument about foreign policy that is not specific to foreign policy, even though it's not dealing with the details. It's dealing with the underlying principle itself that America uses for its foreign policy. And in order to question that, meaning he kind of brings it into focus and asks the question, that question is more so asked to us, the voters ourselves, on whether or not this is something that we want to allow to continue while other things don't. But he makes this argument in this basic way that makes perfect sense. Essentially, in order to understand American foreign policy, you have to take it as a totality, including the consequences to the foreign policy that we've taken around the globe. We need to question the underlying premise to which those policies have been enacted. And in order to question the underlying premise to which those policies have been enacted, you have to look at the consequences of those policies. And oftentimes, mainstream media drops those consequences and don't talk about those from the standpoint of things that we've done wrong or things that have had negative consequences around the globe. When people come into this world, they don't necessarily know why all of the things are. Many times people can go through their life without necessarily understanding why the world is the way the world is. And there have been things that we have done that have not necessarily been to the best, that have created a hostile environment for us to exist in. Sanders goes through these and making this basic argument of, is this the foreign policy you want? Do you really want to spend this much money on military and intervening in the countries around the globe while services at home suffers? We need to question the underlying premise of our military actions around the globe and this interventionist foreign policy. He's using Yemen as an example, but he goes through several coups, one in Chile, one in Guatemala, he goes explicitly in the one in Chile and the one in, there's one more. Oh, in Iran. 19, in fact, let's flip. But I want to read how he phrases this, because it puts you in the mind of that Jimmy Carter speech where Jimmy Carter is being frank and honest to the public, and the public was like, who the fuck is this guy? Several months ago, Democrats with virtually no opposition gave President Trump every nickel that he wanted to increase defense spending. At a time when our infrastructure is crumbling, when our public schools lack the resources to provide a quality education for our kids, when 30 million people have no health insurance, there were very few Democrats who opposed the Republican efforts to increase military spending by $165 billion over the next 2 years. I like that. Essentially, I am not a Democrat. Those, bitches over there are siding with the Republican Party in order to increase military spending. At this point, it's not siding with the Republican Party. They just agree. There's, it's not one side or the other. Here's a truth that you don't often hear about in newspapers, on television, or in the halls of Congress, but it's a truth that we must face. Far too often, American intervention and the use of American military power have produced unintended consequences that have caused incalculable harm. Yes, it's reasonably easy to engineer the overthrow of a government. It is far harder, however, to know the long-term impact that it would have. Yes, that's absolutely true. As a flat fact, that's absolutely true. And he gives examples that may have been dropped from mainstream media when we talk about stuff like this. In 1953, the United States, on behalf of Western oil interests, supported the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's elected prime minister, and reinstalled the Shah of Iran, who led a corrupt, brutal, and unpopular government. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown by revolutionaries led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was created. Now, knowing that, should be afraid of who? Like, this thing where the United States talk about Iran as a big bad enemy, who should be afraid of who? Who is screwing with who? I mean, come on, let's be honest. In 1973, the United States supported against Democratic elected President Chile Salvador Allende, which was led by General Augusto Pinochet. Oh, geez, Pinochet. The result was almost 20 years of authoritarian military rule and the disappearance of torture of thousands of Chileans and the intensification of anti-Americanism in Latin America. Now, again, why is that anti-Americanism? It's there because of the actions and the behaviors of the United States in Latin America. I mean, you can add more. El Salvador, Guatemala, in Vietnam, based on discredited domino theory, the United States replaced French in intervening in a civil war which resulted in the deaths of millions of Vietnamese in support of a corrupt, repressive South Vietnamese government. We must never forget that more than 58,000 Americans also died in that war. Like, this seems a basic argument. Like, the argument makes itself to some degree. We're spending all of this money, and the actions that we're taking are having severe consequences around the globe. You can do another one. Afghanistan. Putting resources into some of the terrorists, or you could say fighters at the time, but eventually they became terrorists, in Afghanistan in order to pull the Soviet Union into Afghanistan and sink them into their own war. But this created a radicalized element of what is the name? I can't think of the name of the group. But essentially the fighters, damn it, I can't think of the name. The fighters that were there in Afghanistan. These guys eventually became Al-Qaeda. I mean, like, the actions that we're taking, yes, they thought they were successful when the Soviet Union gets bogged down into Afghanistan. Not so much when we get hit on 9/11. Point is, unforeseen consequences. Look at Iraq. He mentions Iraq, but you end up with 1 million people dead in Iraq, not to mention 4,000 Americans dead, and the creation of ISIS through this kind of refugee that spreads into Europe, where Europe is having destabilized governments based on refugees. I mean, all of this to some degree is a result of foreign policy, Western foreign policy, so Europe is not necessarily absolved from guilt from this. But these are consequences that we're having around the globe, particularly even to us. And his argument is also Yemen. Essentially, Yemen is the focal point of this, saying we need to get out of Yemen. We've been helping a theocratic regime to essentially pacify a population. Now, to be fair, I don't remember all of this hoopla about Yemen, and it's not hoopla, and I don't mean to trivialize it. I'm not trying to trivialize it. But my point is, this wasn't made a big deal when Obama was in office and when Obama greenlit this. It's a big deal now that Trump is in office because Trump is an easier target to hit than Obama was. And you can also make an argument that the 2020 elections are coming up, but Obama's not, they don't hit Obama on stuff like this. Or at the very least, it didn't when he was in office. Trump is unpopular, so they can hit him with whatever they can get their hands on. So he's talking about the resolution they implemented. So right here. But for a second read, this is even more important. Article 1, he gets into constitutional powers and this idea of Congress is supposed to be control of the purse strings, and it is Congress's right to declare war, not a president's to gallivant around the globe. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is very clear. It is Congress that has a responsibility to declare war and send our armed forces into harm's way. Over the years, Congress has, under both Democratic and Republican leadership, abdicated that responsibility and given it over to the president. The time is long overdue for Congress to regain control of this vitally important process and founding fathers mandated. The issue of which the body has control over war making and when we send troops into battle, it is not some abstract intellectual debate. It is of enormous consequence. Anyone who understands the history of the American foreign policy knows that. Over the years, many of the wars and military interventions were based on lies and deceptions coming from the White House. This is amazing. Like, mainstream media never says this. You must understand, from the standpoint of mainstream media, the perspective is that America is right. It's sacrosanct. It's like if America is within the story, America is doing the right thing. America may fuck up, but ultimately America is doing the right thing. It's never doing something for the wrong reasons. You would have never went into Iraq for the oil. You would have never destabilized Iran. In fact, you wouldn't even mention the fact that it took place at all. You know, if at the time you mentioned, hey, America might have had something to do with it, they were like, oh, look at that guy. What do you mean, America? You're a conspiracy theorist, buddy. Like, the media has a particular framing of events, and that framing often, very rarely, sets America as the bad guy. That's all. That's all I mean by that. That's all I mean by that. So the idea that Sanders is saying this It's making the point that, look, there were wars that were taken for duplicitous reasons. It wasn't us being the good guy. It wasn't us doing the right thing. We can't abdicate the responsibility to the president to declare war. And he goes, again, in the detail to make his point. It is of enormous consequence. Anyone who understands the history of American foreign policy knows that, over the years, many of our wars and military interventions were based on lies and deceptions coming from the White House. The two most significant foreign policy blunders in history of the United States, the war in Iraq and the war in Vietnam, occurred when Congress sat back and allowed two administrations, one Republican and one Democrat, to lie to the American people as they led us into unnecessary conflicts with horrific unintended consequences. We must never allow that to happen again, and that's what our resolution was about. And again, making this point of both Democrat and Republican do this. Fortunately, one person here is not either. Personally, I think that's just base politics, but I could be wrong. Maybe he's added that in. Maybe he's being so insistent on the whole Democrat and Republican thing for no reason. Let's see. I like this. I mean, he goes into detail. So, talking about 9/11, essentially Bush said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there were none. And then making this point of how, I mean, you can go further. The conflict in ISIS, us helping terrorists in order to destabilize that particular part of the globe, us destroying Libya where you have roving gangs where you can buy your own black slave right now. Like, you can go further into these foreign policy blunders, if you want to call them blunders. And there's never a consequence. So this audience knows what the Gulf of Tonkin is, and he's talking about LBJ and Bush administration with the war in Iraq. The lessons that must be learned from all of this foreign policy disasters occur when presidents refuse to tell their people the truth, and when Congress abdicates its constitutional responsibility to get that truth. Not surprisingly, the Trump administration, the Republican congressional leadership, and the military establishment strongly oppose our resolution. Senator Majority Mitch McConnell held a classified hearing with military intelligence leaders to gain support to defeat us, and Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis spoke at both the Republican and Democratic Senate caucus on the day of the vote to support the status quo. Nonetheless, the bill passed on December 13, 2018 with the support of all 49 Democrats as well as 7 Republicans. It is expected to be taken up for a vote by the Democratic-controlled House this year. This is not, like I said, a specific foreign policy speech, but this is asking questions about, the legitimacy of our current foreign policy and the fact that that policy needs to change. And I suspect that this is being put to the voter himself or herself. Do you really want to spend money in this way on these things as opposed to doing things back home? I like this article. And I know I'm going to have some haters. Big fan. Here's a little shade. Ray Foley. Foley. Yeah, Foley. Thank you, Ray. I appreciate it, man. So Bernie is just for... here we are. Creative experiments. So Bernie is just for overthrowing 1 or 2 dictators instead of 7. So that's better. That's called progress, buddy. It's called progress. Nikki, Jamal, can you please cover Mariette's Shima? She's U.S.-born Press TV Iranian journalist detained by the FBI with no charges. I heard about something like that. I'll write it down to check it out. M-A-R-Z-I-E-H. All right. So I'm going to end this because it's almost like 1 a.m. here. Yeah, it's almost like 1 a.m. here. Guys, I appreciate you guys showing up and everybody that supports the content. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this content and you find yourself coming back here often, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks, everyone. Good night. I'll see you guys in the morning.